you both confirmed also three things. I think that time is always on the side of illiberals. It's funny because you all said the same thing. I don't take it for myself who try to make the time respected. But okay, time is always on the side of illiberals. The second thing I think common in your talk was that constitutions are living and full of non-written rules, and it's more easy to break the powers thanks to those kind of rules, of course. And the third one maybe is that democracy is also a question of posture, of appearances or so. And so if you break the posture, if you break everything, it's more easy also to break the rules. So thank you very much. It was, I don't know what you think, but it was very interesting. I guess you have a lot of questions, or maybe do you want to talk? It can be a debate also about how our brilliant speakers just said. So you're the first.
So thank you. Thank you for the three presentations. I have a very naive question, but which have been risen several times over the past 2 days to Julien. And actually, I would have liked to ask Dan Cameron also. I'm asking you because you have chosen to focus on France, which, as you said, should still be considered, we can discuss it, as a liberal democracy. So, very simple question. What is the tipping point at which you, as a legal scholar, I have some ideas as a political theorist, but at which you, as a legal scholar, consider that a liberal democracy ceases to be a liberal democracy? Because yesterday Dan said that the EU should have reacted earlier to Orban, and I perfectly agree, but well, it's fairly easy to say that today, after autocratization has taken place, and the problem today, as you said, that as it was repeated several times, is that autocracy does not become an autocracy overnight, and so there is grey zone. An example, Dan admitted yesterday that the EU should not react to any violation of the rule of law. And as far as I know, I'm not sure actually, but I think that the EU did not react when Darmanin, the French minister, decided to bypass a mesure provisoire. I don't know how you say that in English, sorry. A mesure provisoire of the European Court of Human Rights, and deported an Uzbek who risked torture at home. So should the EU react to such measure? And if it does not, does it risk of waiting too long? So my question is about the guidelines you have in mind. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Justine. It's actually a very good question, of course. The question of when should we consider that there is a change in the global organization of the institutions? I would say that the reason why I would argue, like you, that France, of course, is still a liberal democracy is the fact that the institutions are still democratic. The fact that Macron and Borne didn't try to pack the courts, didn't try to change, to museler, to how do you say in English? To shut down, yes, the parliament per se. Actually, it was a way to shutting down the members of parliament, but by using the very constitution we use since 58. And so I would argue that we have to consider three different things. First, the question of the behaviors of the political actors. Second, the question of the rhetoric used by the actors. And then the question of the effects of those behaviors. When you look at the rhetoric, you can find a lot of people actually using kind of what we could call a populist rhetoric, or something with a sort of illiberal dimension. When you look at Retailleau, Laurent Wauquiez, telling a lot of things about the government of judges, the fact that it's impossible to do anything in France, shaming the Conseil constitutionnel, shaming the European Court of Human Rights. It is something in the language that could have an effect in the political practices at some point, especially if in next year, political leader from an illiberal party were to take the power. Then you have the question of the behavior in itself. What I tried to analyze in my presentation is the fact that at a very specific moment, the way some political actors behaved was something that could be understood as kind of a dangerous behavior when you look at real illiberal regimes. I'm not saying that it changed the nature of the Fifth Republic. I'm not saying that it did change the constitutional balance in France, but I'm saying that it's interesting to see that if they begin to act like this more and more, you could have dangerous effects on that. But when you look at the history of French Fifth Republic, you could argue that, when de Gaulle used Article 11 to change the constitution, when de Gaulle in 1962 and tried in 1969, it was kind of a hardball as well. And so I'm not saying that this is something entirely new. I'm just saying that in the contemporary world, using this kind of behavior is something that we should focus on and that could be dangerous. And then you have the question of the effects of the behavior. So what is the effect of what I just analyzed about Born's behavior, about Macron's behavior? I wouldn't say that, again, that everything changes at the time, but especially since the Conseil Constitutionnel said that it was okay to use all those individual constitutional provisions in order to force the parliament into enacting this bill. But what I'm saying is that on the long run, there is an accoutumance, maybe a way to accept more and more some behavior of political actors that are problematic. That's only what I'm saying.
And that it's preparing the tomorrow maybe illiberal regimes
we'll see.
Yeah, so that's.
But I mean that if they come to power, it will be easy for Bardella, for instance, to say, you know what?
Yeah, it was done before. Yeah.
Nothing new under the sun. What I'm doing is something that.
Or look at de Gaulle.
We've been doing before. Or look at Bardella. Yeah.
Yeah, you can look at de Gaulle. No, sorry, but yes.
Yeah, it's true. Look at de Gaulle. Yeah,
look at de Gaulle.
Marine Le Pen said that National Rassemblement was the new Gaullist party in France. Yeah, so. We can say anything today.
Yeah. I think you are the second. Yeah.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I got a question for Julien. Another one. So the first question is, what about the comparative dimension? So because we are talking about France, but can you see similar behavior? Can you compare France and the use of this tool to accelerate legislation, to force legislation, to similar instrument in other parliamentary democracy, to put France in context, in perspective. I'm not an expert, so I will not be able to do, but I know a country where these tools are used much frequently than France. That is Italy. I got some data. Basically, Meloni used a similar tool of 49.3. That's basically the same. Every 10 days. And Draghi government and other center-left government previously use it like every 8 days on average. So my question is, and if you look at, maybe the Italian case can be exceptional, but there's a pattern that you can see. That is basically, and this is related to how you frame the problem, You frame it as an hardball and as like a symptom or sign of autocratization, backslide. If you see the Italian pattern, you see that the weaker the government politically, the more frequent the use of this kind of procedure. So it's basically the other way around. Instead of being a sign of executive aggrandizement, in the Italian case, is a sign of weak, politically weak executive power. So my question is, can it be the same for the French case? Because if we look to the current minoritarian government in France, these are nothing but strong executive at the end of the day. So that's my question.
Thank you so much. Obviously, I know less of political life than in Italy than you, but what I would argue is the fact that the only fact that you use the 49.3 in France is not on itself a sign of hardball in the way I said it. So, of course, when you use Tuchnet's concept, there is a question of the pre-constitutional, like the convention of what is perceived as fair play in political life in this country. And it can change in every political culture. I mean, in Italy, you say it's normal to use the equivalent of 49.3 every day. So, of course, the fair play in politics, using this tool is not unfair in this dimension. I'm not saying that using the 49.3 in the history of the French Fifth Republic is perceived as unfair. Michel Rocard used a lot the 49.3 because he had, it was actually the first time under the Fifth Republic, a minority government. And at the time, no one would say that it was an illiberal move or something like that, because it was something perceived as the only way for a prime minister weakened by the political forces in the National Assembly to try to pass a piece of legislation. So I would argue that the 49.3 is not the problem in itself. The problem with the Born moment with this pension reform law wasn't the only use of the 49.3, it was the use of several of those tools together. And what I'm saying is that it was exceptional, and so we could all have a look at that. Some people would say, we need the pension reform bill, so it was the only way to pass it, so it's great we did. Opponents to the reform could say it's a scandal, it's a real abomination that they used all those political tools, and etc. What I'm saying is that when you try to take an objective take on an objective look on what was the rules of fair play in French politics before that, actually a lot of people were astonished by the fact that in this very moment they used all those constitutional tools together in a very, what was perceived as a very brutal way. And so I think it's really relative to the way we perceive the constitutional balance at the very moment in a very specific political culture. So this is my answer. I don't know, it's not a real answer because it's not a real comparison with several democracies, but...
My point was that it might not be like a case of executive aggrandizement.
No, I'm not saying it is. Actually,
yeah. To survive and fail.
Absolutely, and I just said that in my presentation that in France, it was not a case of executive aggrandizement. It was a case in the US, it was a case, obviously, in India, but it wasn't the case in France. So it didn't change, I think, the relative position of the president or the prime minister under the French constitution. Yeah.
So I have a good news from our organizer, wonderful organizer. We have more time for the debates, so we can be longer.
Less coffee.
Yeah, and so, no, I don't know. So maybe just a question for John and Petra. Do you look at the Italian situation or not at all? Because I know that Italian observers are always watching at Poland, Hungary. So do you do the same? Are you looking at the Italian situation or not? You want to answer?
We have enough problems.
Enough problem, yeah. I guess it could be your answer, of course, but maybe...
I often teach Dutch judges. And I do that on the basis I do that on the basis of tweets by Giorgia Meloni, criticizing both the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice, because a lot of people seem to only worry about critique of the European Court of Human Rights. But I'll give you this example on why she is dangerous. There was a judgment, I think it's more or less 8 months ago. It was about external processing of asylum claims in Albania. So if you're a keen observer of the Court of Justice, like some of us are here, you always know that there's a press release at 10 and the judgment is actually published at 12. So there was a tweet by Giorgia Meloni at 5 to 12, so before the judgment came out. That is vintage populist full-on attack on a court. I don't know whether she falls within the category of constitutional aggrandizement. I would personally have an issue with a very limited understanding of what is legal under this, because in my view, something can only be legal if it's also within the letter of the law. But we can debate that separately. But it's clear that it's a full-on attack that plays the playbook that Petra laid out very dangerously. Why is it dangerous? Because there's no response. Why? Because it's Italy. Nobody expected it to come from there. So I think that Benedetta is also here, actually wrote about this and in Italy. So I actually think it's extremely dangerous, not only in terms of the rhetoric, but also the complete lack of response, because there's this intuition that you can only put threat to democracy, and that's why I thought Julien's presentation was quite refreshing. If you're actually east of the border of, let's say, Berlin, that democratic backsliding cannot actually happen at all in Western Europe. That's simply wrong. It's also happening in Italy for that reason, with this full-on attacks on the courts, which happen to be my topic. So I'm actually very... I don't think it's a matter of whether it's a strong or a weak executive. It's about populists getting smarter and learning from each other, and what Leonie was mentioning yesterday, that they use different wording to sort of go under the radar of what is now politically acceptable. Yeah.
And they are also stronger because they are league. They are all together, you know, they are supporting. Oh, but they failed with Orban. They all tried to support him, but they failed, except, so another question.
This question is both for Julien and for John. I'm curious, Julien, whether you would accept a friendly, maybe amendment to your characterization of Trump's fast aggrandizement, so that whole list you had of all the different actions that he's been taking to try to very quickly kind of accumulate power. And the friendly amendment might be whether or not after he's doing that sort of fast aggrandizement, and there's pushback or some way in which maybe the courts step in and say you can't do that, whether we see after that a slower aggrandizement. So I'm thinking, for example, in the Minneapolis mass deportation situation, right? We see a situation where we get, kind of this militarized response. We get very public raids, streets, lots of violence. And then, that there's a public backlash. What we see after that is they appoint somebody else, Thomas Homan, who's going to do things sort of more gently and more slowly. In other words, now we're going to see racialized workplace enforcement instead, which is, maybe that's just as illegal, but it seems gentler and kinder now. And so we still see that aggrandizement of power, but now we have kind of two steps to it and it becomes slower. For John, I am wondering actually whether one way of understanding the difference between Strasbourg and Luxembourg is where the two courts are putting a proof on whether the judgment is legitimate. And if we characterize it that way, if one court is saying, well, we're going to put the burden of proof on one party and say you have to show that the judgment is either legitimate or illegitimate versus the other party, then maybe we can start thinking about whether the right way to do that is the way that we think about placing burdens of proof on one party or the other. So we might place the burden of proof on one party because they have more information about whether or not that judgment is legitimate or illegitimate, and kind of put some of the other ways that we think about which party is appropriate to hold that burden of proof, and whether that's kind of one way to sort that out. Because I think your point about whether one court is delegitimizing the other one is a really important one, and that there needs to be some principled basis for sorting that out.
Thank you very much. So maybe Julien and then John.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. I absolutely agree with you. What I'm saying is that you have a difference between the fast aggrandizement and the slow one. When you only have the slow aggrandizement, it's like cooking a lobster. I'm talking to you, I know you come from Boston. It's like very slow, and some people can say, we didn't see that coming, actually. It took time, and at the end of the day, we said, okay, after 10 years, yes, of course, it was an aggrandizement. At the time, we didn't see it. When you have a fast aggrandizement like Trump 2, everybody saw it at first. And of course, it can entail then a slow consolidation of this aggrandizement, as you said. But the big difference between Modi or, I don't know, like Trump, is the fact that Modi, some people would say, like, yeah, it took time to really discover what he was doing. Trump, everybody is like, it's really clear, especially the second time. And then the fact that there is a consolidation after that, doesn't change anything. It's kind of a stratification of actions from Trump entailing such an aggrandizement or consolidating what he tried to do, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It has multiple layers. I'll explain why. So in your question, you put it to me as though we're talking about a judgment, but it's actually legally a question whether something that comes out of a body like this is at all a judgment, right? I think that to some extent, what we're seeing playing out live is that both courts are scared of the consequences of the logic of their own reasoning. Because if you look at what comes out of this as something that can never constitute a fair trial because it's actually a tribunal established by law. You're basically ruling as the European Court of Human Rights that one of the biggest member states in Europe and the 9th biggest economy in the world by now does not have a functional court system, which is quite a statement to make, particularly when you give investment advice and that kind of stuff. Is it safe to open a factory there, for example? The same with the European Court of Justice. It's very principled on some elements of judicial independence, particularly when it adds to its own power, because there's all power that is behind it, its own power, and who can decide on who should remain in power. The Court of Justice can always be predicted to come to a conclusion that actually empowers it itself. But if you then drive that home by, for example, saying that if something comes out of a Polish court that cannot actually be seen as a judgment, then the whole system of the internal market collapses. So I don't think it's so much. So that's one element of it. In terms of burden of proof, I think that the logic of having an individual rights approach always puts the burden of proof on the party that is not the weakest party, because you're trying to defend the individual rights of a person. In the European system of legal protection, it's actually very difficult as an individual to reach the European Court of Justice yourself anyway, because the assumption is that you will always move through a national court. So in that system, probably the burden of proof will be more even on the individual rather than the other way around. But it's a very I mean, on social media, for example, Professor Pers refuses to call this a court, and he calls people that are on the imposters. It's a very difficult problem there's not really language for talking about hybridity in this way, which also makes it very confusing for journalists, because if you talk, you almost feel like a conspiracy theorist when you're just describing what's happening here legally. It takes quite a while to sort of bring journalists up to speed, and then you always wonder what kind of headline they'll put anyway. But it's tricky in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you. Everyone.
Thank you so much for your very fascinating presentations. I enjoyed it very much. I have a question, in fact, two questions for Petra. John proposes a law in order to restore the independence of the judiciary in Hungary, and I was thinking of what was going on in Hungary, and I wonder what you think are the main hurdles Peter Magyar is facing actually in Hungary in order to restore the rule of law and democracy, and what would be your first advice, your first strategic move you will advise the government to do in order to restore the rule of law and democracy in Hungary after 16 years of the Fidesz party establishing an illiberal environment?
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. And actually, that relates to the previous question as well, my answer, how fast you have to go, how slow you have to go. I think There have been attempts also in Hungary to do some very fast-track changes, like with regard to administrative courts, and then there was backlash from the European Union. Very slowly, the same administrative law system has been established with courts doing administrative law or adjudicating administrative law issues, but then it went under the radar, and it was much more efficient in a way from an illiberal perspective. Same thing with punitive populism. Yeah, we will reintroduce the death penalty, which is a no-go in Council of Europe states. Of course, there was a huge backlash, but now we have life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, so life is life. We have criminalization of homelessness and whatnot. So it's slowly we are getting there to punitive populism, but not as fast. Now, when it comes to dismantling democracy or rebuilding democracy, for that matter, I think there are certain steps that you have to make fast, and this is especially the Constitutional Court, because the Constitutional Court can always say this is unconstitutional. This is exactly what Fidesz did. They drafted their own constitution, and then they did two things with regard to the Constitutional Court. They first of all packed the Constitutional Court, and then they also took the powers away of the Constitutional Court just to be on the safe side. And whenever the Constitution said something like, okay, that might be unconstitutional, or this amendment doesn't correspond to constitutionalism, then the government, which corresponds to two-thirds majority of the parliament in Hungary, essentially said that there is no such a thing as unconstitutional constitutional amendment. Whatever is in the Constitution is constitutional, period, and the Hungarian Constitutional Court doesn't have the power to say anything unless there were some procedural irregularities. Now, this also holds true for rebuilding the rule of law. And I think one thing that we really have to take into consideration is not to make the same mistakes that the illiberals did. So, of course, you cannot have a very clean legality when rebuilding the rule of law, unfortunately. So you have to break through the principle of legality. The other side will also always say legality equals the rule of law. So whatever law is, there are these apostles of positive law. Whatever is written down is the law, and if you break it, then you are a rule of law violator. Unfortunately, this is not how it works. I think European Union law helps us, and also ECHR law helps us. Now, I'm not referring to the Venice Commission, but indeed to the ECHR in the framework of the Council of Europe. There is case law in Strasbourg saying that if a judge has been appointed irregularly or illegally, then the judge must be removed. So the irremovability of judges is not a value per se above all values, but if someone has been irregularly appointed, he or she must be removed in order to re-establish judicial independence. So we can already refer to European law. Very concretely answering your question, I think the very first steps should be removing the president and changing the Hungarian Constitutional Court, because with the current president and with the currently captured Hungarian Constitutional Court, you cannot do the changes that the Magyar government is trying to do. Unfortunately, this happened in Poland, where Tusk and the wonderful previous Justice Minister Adam Bodnar very much wanted to do the changes that they couldn't because the president vetoed everything, and the captured Constitutional Tribunal said it was unconstitutional what they were trying to do. So we can very easily enter a very similar situation. The president previously never sent a single law to an ex-ante review to the Hungarian Constitutional Court, but now he might find his identity as a constitutional scholar, and let's not forget that he used to be the president of the Constitutional Court back in the days, so he may just send every single piece of legislation for an ex-ante review to the captured Constitutional Court, and that's the end of the story. Now, of course, the situation is different from Poland because they have a constitution-making majority, so they can change the constitution so as to weaken the powers also of the president. So Magyar is now putting a huge pressure on the president to resign. I think he's also psychologically not necessarily fit to withhold the pressure. So by the 31st of May, we will see whether he indeed resigns or not, but this is the plan. And also the powers of the Constitutional Court can be, to some extent, amended by a new constitutional change. So I'm more positive, and that's why I brought you my last slide, which I took on the 12th of April on the square Batyányi, where Magyar was making his speech, very, very, very pro-European and anti-corruption. So I'm looking into positively in the bright future, very untypical for Hungarian.
Thank you very much. A positive conclusion for a really wonderful panel. Thank you for all the speakers. They were very good, and thank you very much for your questions, very interesting questions. So see you soon after a break, a coffee break, where?
Yes, we have a coffee break in Salle des Professeurs. We will resume our work at 11:10. It's okay for everybody.